Expats Lives, the Expats Community YouTube channel.
Please subscribe.
What led you to write this book?
Well, so my book is not specific to anywhere in particular. It's just in general. But most of the issues you will encounter when you move abroad are going to be very similar, aside from the local things. And when I lived in Mexico for a year and a half, I kept seeing online the same questions over and over and over from people. Well, how do I do this? How do I do that? And I actually started writing the outline for the book while I was living in Mexico. And then I moved to Ecuador. What I did was I traveled around to different places while I was still working and visited Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, anyway, quite a number of different places. And even within Mexico, it being such a large country, I visited different parts of Mexico. But what I wanted to do was put this book out there. And so when I was in Ecuador during the pandemic, we had a lockdown where we couldn't leave our house. And after obsessively following the news for a while, I realized that wasn't healthy. And I thought, oh, this would be the perfect time to start working on my book. So.
This is why. Who should not move abroad?
Well, I've lived abroad long enough, because it's been almost 7 years now. I've seen some really unhappy expats, and a lot of them end up moving back to the U.S. The ones who are the most miserable are the ones who can't afford to move back to the U.S. And but we're seeing more and more economic refugees abroad, or people who just don't have enough money for retirement, or they've been wiped out by healthcare expenses in the U.S., which are astronomical, or for some other reason, a divorce. It can be anything, and they just don't have enough money to live on abroad. So, but who should not move abroad? Well, if you're just looking for a cheaper place to live, but you want it to be exactly like the U.S., that is not going to work. You will be miserable. I would say, you need to have an open mind and be curious and interested in learning about other cultures. Ideally, you want to learn some of the local language, whatever language that is, for many reasons, but you'll be much, much happier if you can communicate with the locals. You can make friends, get involved in the community. You won't be living in a ghetto of just other expats, You'll be able to have some friends in the local community.
What character traits help a person to be successful?
So the character traits that will make a successful expat, first of all, I would say you've got to have a sense of adventure and be very open to new experiences and what may seem to you to be really strange things. And I'll have a lot of patience. I mean, sometimes here in Cuenca, I've gotten on the wrong bus or going in the wrong direction. And instead of getting upset about it, I'm like, okay, well, at least I've learned, where the bus goes in this direction. Or I'll see something that I didn't know was there before, and I say, I have to come back here and check this out later, because there's something I didn't know was there. So even if you have a mishap, something, you can turn it into something positive. So you just need to have a flexible attitude and not be really rigid about wanting things a particular way, and try not to be too susceptible to jumping to a conclusion that somebody is, you may misinterpret something, like, the locals are bad people or something, because it's easy to misinterpret things when it's really a cultural difference.
Okay, how should someone thinking about moving abroad decide where to go?
How should someone decide where to go? Well, in my book, I have a whole chapter on this topic, and it's really going to be completely different for every person because it depends on what it is you're looking for. I can tell you, I had a kind of a bucket list of things, and I had lived in Guanajuato, which is a city of about 80,000, has a university there, a lot of cultural things, but it's a really small town, and I found after living there for almost 2 years, if you needed to buy something, you had to go to León, and you had to get the bus, go to León, and it got old after a while. So I wanted I didn't want to live in a huge big city, but I wanted something bigger than 80,000 people. And I wanted, one or more universities and some cultural activities and a place that would have a middle class, not just super rich people and poor people. But each person is going to have to decide for themselves, like, what do you like in the way of climate? Some people want to be near water, on the beach. I didn't want hot, humid weather, but other people, they love it. So it's to each their own. It doesn't really, there's no right or wrong answer in general. You have to decide what is it you're looking for. You definitely want to investigate healthcare, what's available there. Other things that are important to you, you want to investigate. Probably wherever you are, you're going to want to have good internet. But really you want to start with your budget and say, okay, how much money do I live on? Do I need to work to earn money? If you're going to need to work, then you're going to have to find places that will let you work there. It so happens Ecuador has a professional visa if you're a college graduate it's a very long list of universities. They will let you work here. I would be allowed to work here if I wanted to, but you can always work online for a U.S. employer, and that's usually pretty under the radar because your paycheck would be going into a U.S. bank, and who's going to know? But start with your budget, and then other attributes that you want, like I was saying, cultural amenities. You can't live without certain things. You want opera. Do you need to have? You want to have another expat community there or not? Food, all sorts of things. And then once you've developed all that, then you can start looking at, okay, what countries fit my criteria that have a visa that I can get for permanent residency.
Okay. Could you tell us how did you choose Cuenca?
How did I choose Cuenca? Good question. Well, when I was living in Mexico, I didn't have residency. I had a tourist visa, which meant every 6 months I had to leave the country and get my passport stamped. And Mexico is very, very casual, at least if you're from North America. Canadians and Americans, they tolerate you doing that long term, although I don't know how long that's going to last, but up until now you've been able to. So every 6 months I would take a trip somewhere and combine it with, it's a place I wanted to check out. And so, I visited Nicaragua. Anyway, so Cuenca had been on my list, but it hadn't been at the top of the list. And so one of my little 6-month border run trips, I thought, okay, let's go visit Cuenca. I was going to go earlier at Christmas, but it was really expensive to come at that time of year. So I came 6 months later, it was in June and July, because it was much cheaper. It kind of just ticked all the boxes of everything I wanted. We have 4 universities here. I like the climate because I didn't, some people find it too cold. It's like, this is too cold. But, there's plenty of places that are warm, so there's no shortage. Even within Ecuador, there's lots of places that are warm. But, it has a nice middle class here. Lots of professionals, very, very good healthcare. People travel here for their healthcare from other parts of Ecuador. And I'm talking about Ecuadorians. Ecuadorians travel to Cuenca for healthcare. I was surprised when I was working, volunteering, doing an English pronunciation class at the university. And my students told me that, oh yeah, we travel to Cuenca from Guayaquil to get healthcare. And that surprised me because Guayaquil is a much larger city, but the doctors and the professionals, the specialists, they like living here in Cuenca too.
What to do with your personal belongings?
What things should you bring with you and what things should you sell or get rid of? And again, it's going to vary depending on where you're going and what the local cost of things is. Some people, moving to Ecuador, people tend to go to one of two extremes, which you don't have to do, but either they'll bring a full container full of furniture and belongings, or they'll come with 5 suitcases. And I actually kind of didn't do either of those because I had a lot of books, so I shared a container with someone else. But in my book, I have a whole chapter on this of how to decide what to leave behind and what to bring, and also how do you get rid of stuff. Because sometimes you'll have family photos or family heirlooms or things that maybe a member of the immediate family doesn't want, or you don't have any relatives who want. But there are things don't just throw them out. There's places that want to have that, so you can donate things. Anyway, it's a whole chapter of my book on this subject. But what I recommend is always go visit a place you're thinking about moving to. There are people who just pick up and move and have never been to a place, and quite often that doesn't end well. But while you're visiting a place, and you're not there to be a tourist, you're there to do research, go to the stores and see, well, how much does a washing machine cost? How much, like for example, I have a KitchenAid mixer. It's $250, $200 in the US. There's $600 here in Ecuador. So that's something, if you really want it, you better bring it. Because yes, you can get it here, but it's 3 times the price. Automobiles are another thing. You probably don't want to ship them because you're going to stick out as a foreigner, first of all, and the mechanics locally aren't going to be familiar with the model, and it may be impossible to get spare parts. There's all sorts of reasons for that. And I know I've talked to some people who are absolutely in love with their car, and I couldn't possibly part with my car. And I went, well, you're probably going to regret it if you ship it, but okay.
How do I keep in touch with the US?
This is a really, really important topic of how do you keep in touch with the US. Because even if you want to completely cut your ties, I recommend you do keep a bank account, and that's another chapter of my book. But in order to do a lot of transactions in the US, you've got to be able to receive a text message. And so you've got to have the right kind of phone that can receive a text message, because it's called two-factor authentication. But there's also a lot of really inexpensive ways to have calling back and forth. And I see people paying a lot of money for something when there's cheaper ways of doing it. But it all depends on what you need to have. Some people need to have a physical phone number, but it's easy to have a US phone number while you're living abroad. That is like no problem at all, super easy to do. The question is, there's about 10 million different ways of doing that and how you want to pay for it. But you don't have to pay a lot of money for it, but it is important. Like, what are you going to do if you need to call the IRS about your tax return? You've got to be able, well, guess what? Skype, you can call 1-800 number for free. Yes. Even if you don't, I don't use Skype all that much except for 800 numbers, or if my credit card company is doing something where I have to call or Amazon or LL Bean or somebody. 800 number calls are free on Skype. So anyway, it's a really important topic that you need to give some thought to before you get abroad, because I see a lot of people, they get here and then they realize, oh, my phone doesn't work here. Yeah. And you don't have to have 2 separate phones. You can have one phone. So an exciting new development in cell phone technology is eSIMs, which for right now, it's only in the real high-end phones that are going to be $1,000 or $1,200. But I think in a couple of years, it'll be in a lot more phones. But it's like it's your SIM card that you use now physically, except this is a virtual SIM card. And when you're traveling, it's fabulous because you can download it to your phone and sign up with a local provider for, if you're going to be there for a month or 2 months. And I believe that you could go up to a year with some places, but especially if you're going to travel all these different places. So you don't have to hassle anymore with, you land somewhere and your phone doesn't work and you have to find a store and buy a SIM card. You won't have to do that anymore. But unless you have a high-end phone right now, most of them still won't take the technology, but it is coming in the future. Okay.
Okay, great. So, how do I get US mail and packages?
Yeah, packages. So how do I get US mail and packages from the US? And this has become a lot easier now than it was 20 years ago. There's a lot of mail services that originally started for people who lived on boats, sailboats full time, or have RVs, and they're just full-time RVs and they're kind of nomads. But it works really well for expats too. So these mail service places will, you do a change of address, so all your mail goes to them, and they scan the outside of the envelope. You have an account, and you log on periodically, and you can see what your mail is. Typically, they will email you when something comes. And you can tell them, well, throw that in the trash, or send that on to me and ship it here, or shred it, you know. Or you can tell them, open it and scan the inside of it, and then you can tell them to shred it. So that part's real easy, but you have to realize deciding on where you're going to get your mail has some state income tax implications as well, because it's also where you have your driver's license and where you register to vote. And I have a whole chapter on that, on state income tax, which we'll get to in a minute. But if you only want mail, then it's a simpler question of where to pick to have the mail service, because there's places in every state in the U.S. that you can use. And for getting packages, you've got a number of options. Depending on where you're living, there may be companies locally in the country where you're living where, typically for Latin America anyway, they have places in Florida, and you order from Amazon or LL Bean or whatever, and you ship it to, you have it sent to them, and then they will send it to the country where you're living and go and track it through customs and everything, and then they'll arrange to deliver it. You can also, if you've got something bulky, like maybe you want to buy some furniture, you can, if you can find somebody who happens to be moving to where you are in a container, usually they'll have some extra space for something, and you can put it in their container under their name, which is a little more of a risk, but or you could find somebody to bring something for you, especially if it's something fairly small. If there's somebody visiting another expat or something, they can bring it in their luggage. You know, if you have to have your fix for something in particular, candy or something.
What trips people up with banking?
Yeah, because there's a lot of little nuances that you have to be aware of on banking, and I can't really go into all of it, but you know, I have a whole chapter on it in my book. A lot of U.S. banks are going to get a little nervous if they find out you're living abroad, so it's better to keep a low profile, and you could just tell them, I'm traveling extensively, I'm retired and I'm traveling. Brokerage firms are a little trickier because there's prohibitions on, even if you're a U.S. citizen living abroad, you're not supposed to own mutual funds or certain investments, and the brokerage firms just don't want to be bothered with policing, you know, well, who's living abroad and who's not, and they just don't want to deal with it. So if they find out you're living abroad, they may close your account. And that's been happening more and more in Europe. Actually, it's worldwide. If you're a U.S. citizen living abroad and you have a brokerage account in the U.S., you just have to be really careful because they could close your account. I actually moved my accounts when I contacted who I was using for my retirement money, and they said, oh, well, if we find out you're living abroad, we're going to close your account. And I thought, really? And I had been with them for like 30 years, and so I just kind of said, okay, bye. And then after I moved my money, I took pleasure, and I wrote about 5 letters to different executives, and they just said, yeah, you know, you've lost me as a customer. Because I was so annoyed. But anyway, so you've got a lot of issues though, like how to do wire transfers and, you know, using your ATM card abroad. I do recommend you have a local bank account wherever you're living, but you want to be careful with that and choose wisely, because foreign banks can and do go out of business, and you may lose your deposit, and the government deposit insurance may not be what it is in the U.S., so you just need to investigate that carefully.
Should I keep my U.S. bank account?
Should I keep a U.S. bank account? I recommend you do, because how are you gonna, like, let's say you do your income tax return every year, which as U.S. citizens we have to do regardless of where we live. How are you gonna pay the IRS? Oh, should we pause?
Yes, give me a chance. Sorry. Yes. Continue. We can continue now.
Okay. So how are you going to pay if you owe money to the IRS on your tax return? How are you going to pay that if you don't have a U.S. bank account? It's going to be a lot more complicated. The bottom line, I mean, when you're living abroad, you want to do as much as possible electronically or online, and you want to avoid paper checks or paper anything. Do it, you want to get all your credit card statements online. You want to do everything online. So keeping a U.S. bank account, you don't have to keep a lot of money in it necessarily, but I think you're going to regret not having a U.S. bank account.
Why do I need to be able to receive text messages?
Text messages.
Text messages.
Yeah. And that, you may want to edit it out. I mentioned it earlier. But I mean, I've seen people here, in Mexico, wherever, expats, where they're able to log onto their bank account for a while online because they have a cookie on their hard drive, but eventually the hard drive crashes or the computer dies, something happens, and they can't get into their account anymore because they have a different hard drive or a new computer, and they're unable to receive a text message. And so they can't get access to their account online at all, and then they have to call on the phone. Anyway, life is very, very difficult if you can't access your bank account online.
Can I receive Social Security while living abroad? What is the proof of life procedure?
The good news is, yes, you can receive Social Security living abroad. It's a legal entitlement that the only time you're going to have a problem is if you're living in North Korea or Cuba or Iran or someplace like that where they have a block on payments going there. But I think for the vast majority of people, you're not going to be in North Korea, Cuba, or Iran. So the decision you have to make with Social Security is, do you want it to go to a U.S. bank or a foreign bank where you're living? And there's pros and cons to either of those decisions. I go into all that, and I have a whole chapter in my book on Social Security. But there is a procedure if you're living abroad and receiving Social Security. Even if you have a U.S. address and a U.S. bank account, you're supposed to, and I will say you're supposed to, tell them that you're living abroad, because they have a proof of life procedure, which is every 2 years. There's a form. They send it to you in the mail. Most people never receive it because where they're living, the mail doesn't work very well. But you can get it online as well. But it's a form you're supposed to fill out and say, yes, I'm still alive. Don't stop my benefits. And if they don't get this form back, then they will cut off your benefits, and then they'll definitely hear from you then when you're not getting your Social Security payment. But during the pandemic, they stopped doing this for 2 years, and so they've just started doing this again, I believe in July or August of 2022. But for the last 2 years, they haven't been doing it, so they're starting it up again. So that's just something to be aware of if you're living abroad and getting Social Security.
Yes.
How can you vote from abroad?
Voting can be pretty complicated. It really depends on where you're registered to vote in the U.S. because it's a local process. The U.S. doesn't have a federal voting system. And it's in my chapter on state income tax, because where you register to vote affects your domicile for state income tax purposes. So, and also your driver's license, if you're going to have a U.S. driver's license, that will affect your state income tax situation. So you have to be aware of all these things when you're making these decisions, like if you're going to be voting and you're going to have a driver's license and you're going to get mail, like where do you want to pick that to be? And I talk about in my other chapter about South Dakota is a state that will let you do all that even if you don't have a physical address there. But anyway, voting can be really complicated, or it can be easy. A few states will let you vote online, but most of them, they still want a paper ballot. You may be able to find a group of Democrats abroad or Republicans abroad who facilitate voting when there's elections. And like the last federal election, presidential election we had in 2020, the local Democrats abroad group here in Cuenca arranged for a special price with DHL. So if you had to mail your ballot back, I think it was $25 instead of, it would normally be like $70 or $75. So that was really nice, but we still had to pay $25 to vote. Some states will let you fax it in or email it, but it really depends on where you're registered to vote. But it's a pain in the butt. It's a real headache, regardless of where you live abroad.
How can I watch US TV and movies while living abroad?
Oh, yes. This is one of my favorite topics because there are a lot more options than you think. And I learned a lot more about this after I moved abroad. But because so much of entertainment nowadays is through streaming anyway, it's become much, much easier. But I highly recommend using an Amazon Fire Stick because you can put other Android apps onto the Fire Stick. You can't save any content, of course, to a Fire Stick. But if you use it in conjunction with a VPN, which is a virtual private network, you can access US content because Netflix, for example, has different content in different countries. Like I remember when I lived in Mexico, I could watch Downton Abbey, and I'm like, wow, because in the US they didn't have Downton Abbey. It happened to be one of the shows I like. There's also some other apps that are unofficial, I guess you could call them, that will also allow you to access a lot of content without having to pay somebody like Netflix. But a VPN is really important to have for, and there's a lot of VPNs that really won't work with video streaming, and there's only a few that will work well with it. So, but yeah, I have a whole chapter, and there's also ways of getting books and from libraries electronically, online. So that's in the same chapter.
What are the issues in obtaining health care abroad?
Healthcare, oh. This was one of the issues that drove me crazy living in the US. And I had extremely good health care from my employer, but I got so frustrated with it because it was so dysfunctional. And I have to tell all of you out there in YouTube land, or whoever's watching this video, healthcare in the rest of the world is like 10 or 15% of what we pay in the US. And it's really hard to overemphasize how bad the situation is in the US because I'm talking about even in Europe. I mean, if you want to go see a specialist, I'm sorry, you don't have to wait 6 or 8 weeks to get an appointment. And I had some friends in the US who was diagnosed recently with a neurological problem, and it took them 8 weeks to get an appointment to see a neurologist. And if you have Medicare, it's the same thing. You're still going to wait 6 or 8 weeks to get an appointment with a specialist or more. And I kept joking that, well, why don't you come here, come visit me here, and you could come see somebody the next day. And a neurologist here, for an appointment would charge at the most $50 for a consultation, maybe $60. And he would run some tests, but it's just a fraction of. And drugs. Don't even get me started on medications because it's insanely expensive in the U.S. and you can get stuff here for, cholesterol drug in the U.S. that's $100 you can get it here for $10. It's the exact same thing.
Wow.
But that's something you want to investigate when you're deciding where to go. What's the situation locally?
Okay. 11. What are the issues of healthcare? Okay. Why is computer security so important for expats?
Computer security is essential for expats. It's critical because you literally have your whole life online and you're doing everything online, from email to banking to your streaming of programs, although that's probably not life or death matter. But if you get cut off from your bank, or you get hacked and somebody gets access to your passwords, or you want to make sure you have everything backed up. There's lots of different ways to do that, which I talk about in my book, but something that's automated that will do it in the background automatically so you don't have to think about it is a good idea. I use a cloud-based backup, but You can have a physical hard drive, but the problem is if you have a fire or some kind of physical catastrophe in your house, that backup could also get damaged or lost. But I think I mentioned earlier, like there was an expat who their hard drive crashed and they lost access to their bank account information because they weren't able to receive text messages. But a VPN is really critical also as part of your security scheme because it will protect you from somebody potentially hacking into your computer. Well, another reason it's so important to have everything backed up is one of the big crimes that's becoming more and more popular is just hackers get into your computer and they encrypt everything and then extort money to restore it to you. And if you have everything backed up, you can just tell them, bye, I don't care, and wipe your drive clean and reinstall everything and you'll be fine. But if you don't have things backed up, then you may have to pay them a ransom.
So that's something that can happen everywhere in the world, even in the States, I think.
Oh, big time. Okay. I don't know if you remember last year, the whole East Coast distribution of gasoline was shut down for like a week because of a ransom attack on a refinery. It was in Louisiana, I think, or somewhere. But anyway, it was bad.
What are the federal state aspects of being an expat?
Okay.
Well, the good news is, Uncle Sam, at the federal level, there's some nice benefits. If you have earned income from abroad, and there's certain requirements you have to meet, and there's 2 different tests, you can meet either one, and I go into all this in my chapter on federal income tax. But there's something called the federal earned income exclusion, and so if you are working abroad or self-employed, but you have to actually be providing services, you can exclude that earned income up to a certain ceiling, and it changes every year. For 2022, it's $112,000, and a lot of people mistakenly think, oh, well, if I earn $50,000, I don't have to file a return because of this exclusion. And no, the way to get this exclusion is you have to file a return to claim it. Now keep in mind, state income tax is a different animal, and the states may not recognize the exclusion of earned income, depends. But if you live in a state, if you pick a state for your residency before you leave that doesn't have a state income tax, like Texas or Washington State, there's, I forget, 11 or 13 different states that don't have an income tax, then you won't have that problem. South Dakota is also one of them. So in addition to the foreign earned income exclusion, if you have foreign bank account, there's some headaches that go along with it. There's some filing requirements that you have to do every year, and depending on how much money you have. But as a rule of thumb, if it's more than $10,000, they want to know about it. So for it's a very simple form, and people get upset about filing it, but I don't know. It's very simple to do. So you include one with your tax return, and then there's another form with a different government agency if you meet their criteria. But this is all in my book, so. Making wire transfers can be a little tricky. Everything okay?
Yes.
It can get it's getting more and more difficult every year to do wire transfers, like especially if you're going to buy a house or you're buying a business or something. It's getting more difficult every year. The other thing to worry about with federal income tax is if you want to be a business owner abroad, if it's a business that's going to be a separate legal entity abroad, there's some reporting requirements every year for that. Depending on whether it's a corporation or a partnership, I mean, the form numbers are different, but if you're more than a 10% owner as a U.S. person, there's a reporting requirements, and there's some very, very stiff penalties if you don't report. And if it's over a 50% ownership by a U.S. person or a combination, I guess, then you've got more filing requirements to do. But the penalty for not filing some of that is $10,000 a year. So you don't want to not. I remember when I lived in Mexico, I had some friends they were going to invest in a bakery run by an expat, and they were going to be 60% owners. And when I explained to them what the tax implications of that were in the reporting, they went, "Oh my God, we had no idea." And I said, if you structure it as a loan, that would be better. Yes, your driver's license is an important thing. You just need to be aware of the implications. For example, I knew some expats who lived in another country, not in Ecuador, and they were from Oregon, and they actually, on the Oregon driver's license, they actually got the DMV clerk to change their address to Mexico. And they said, "Oh, well, we don't have any problem because the address is in Mexico for our Oregon driver's license." And I had to explain to them, no, that doesn't solve any problem, and it's worse, actually, because there's a concept in taxation for state tax. You have domicile and you have residence, and those are two different things. And you can be a resident living abroad and you're still domiciled in a state in the U.S. And all the things that go into domicile, which is where, it's kind of like where are you based in the U.S., but it's a facts and circumstances test. But one of the things is your driver's license. And also, where do you vote, where do you have your bank accounts, where you have social ties, anyway, all that, or you own property. But none of those, well, owning property in and of itself does not determine your domicile, but if you have it in addition to other things. Now, if you have a driver's license and you're using an address of, let's say, your Aunt Mabel, or a relative somewhere, and you file the state tax return with that, but, or you don't, let's say you don't file a state tax return, either way, and you file your federal return, you may get a letter from the state where, the address you're using, and they may say, "Well, gee, how come you didn't file a return?" And then you have to write them a letter and explain, "Well, I live abroad and I'm just using this address." It's a big pain in the butt. And then you're going to be on their radar for, do they want to maybe pursue a domicile situation? So better to stay under the radar.
What are the top reasons that expats return to the U.S.?
What are the top reasons expats return to the U.S.? And this goes back to why do you want to move abroad and what traits make it more probable that you'll be a successful expat. But really, the top reasons people go back to the U.S. are, the number one reason is language problems, because you get so frustrated not being able to communicate even the simplest little thing, and it just gets to be too much. You just get to be so frustrated. And that's why I would recommend, if you're thinking of moving abroad, think about where you want to go, and maybe while you're still in the U.S., start taking some language classes or lessons. And I have a whole bunch of tips on ways to learn a language without, you don't necessarily have to go to classes or take lessons, but there's other ways you can do things. The other most frequent reasons why people go back to the U.S. is maybe when they moved abroad, their children didn't have any children, but now they have grandchildren, and they don't want to be strangers to their grandchildren, so they want to see their grandchildren. Healthcare problems. If you've got a health condition that isn't easily treated where you're living abroad, quite often people will move back to the U.S. because of that. Or the other top reason is if the expats have elderly family members who need help managing, or they need care, parents or aunts and uncles or whoever. That's another reason why people will move back, was to help care for people who need help in their family. And during the pandemic, a lot of people moved back just out of fear that someone was going to die before they could see them again. Yeah. But those are the main reasons.
Okay, and in your case, have you think in coming back to the States or in some moment with some issue?
No, me personally, no.
No. You have lived in several countries.
Yeah, I lived in Germany for over a year in the 1980s. Yeah.
Okay, and you live in Hawaii also?
Lived in Hawaii. Lived on the East Coast, lived on the West Coast, so I'm kind of a nomadic soul, I guess. I like traveling, and I like new things and new experiences. I guess all I would say is there's a whole world out there, and if you're miserable in your job and you think I'm never going to be able to retire because I don't have enough money, and there's all these articles out there that the financial press say you have to have $3 million before you can afford to retire. It's not true, because there's a lot of places in the world you can live much less expensive. You know, the three big things that are expensive in the U.S. is education, healthcare, and housing. And guess what? All three of those are a lot cheaper outside the U.S., especially healthcare, you know. But housing has just gotten to be such a crisis in the U.S. And I mean, let me tell you, here in Cuenca, I mean, you can rent a really, really nice apartment that's upscale for, you know, $600 or $700 a month. It would be very, very fancy apartment with an elevator and a doorman and everything, you know. So I would say think about it, because there's a whole big world out there, but don't make any sudden decisions. Think it over slowly, take your time, don't rush into it. Okay.
Nice. Well, we can cut now.
Cut.
Expats Lives, the Expats community YouTube channel.
Please subscribe.